Welcome to the Wizards Brew podcast. I'm Carl Jalm.
And I'm Daniel Nyheis.
So this week, we're going to do a little bit of a kind of a level up episode, a good way to improve your deck building. One of the greatest things you can do is to take a known list and make a few changes to it, kind of customize it for your local metagame. So we're going to be tweaking some Netdecks this episode.
There's people out there that are like, oh, I don't Netdeck because it's, the devil pretty much. And look, that's perfectly fine. If you don't want to play Netdeck and stuff like that. But here's the thing. Netdecks are done because, or they are out there because they're technically the best decks to play. What we're looking to do now is, now that we have the best deck in our hands, we want to improve it. We want to make it better for us. I mean, a prime example is how I've talked about ad nauseum for a million years now, where I have refined a list to make it tuned for a specific meta.
One of the big things, if we look at Standard, for instance, looking at what your local metagame looks like, it may not look like the Pro Tour, where a lot of people are on Etherworks Marvel or Zombies variants or even vehicles. You may have just everyone's playing Zombies, or you have a lot of people playing Black-Green Energy or Black-Green Delirium. And so the same 75 card list that someone gets to the top 8 of the Pro Tour with may not be correct for the competition that you will be seeing in your local shop. So you need to make some changes to it to adjust for that. Take some cards out of the sideboard, put in some other ones that are going to improve the matchups you're going to see.
So that way you can walk into a tournament and feel more confident for a matchup.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the very first step of tweaking a net deck is, of course, to find the net deck. So there's a couple of different places where you can look at lists that are performing well, and you can just make some changes to it to improve its game against some of the decks you'll be likely to see. One of the first places to look is the Magic Online leagues. The Mothership puts up a list of the 5-0 decks in their league. So that's every undefeated deck that comes through week after week. They'll put up a list of what those decks contained.
Eventually, what's going to happen is you start seeing the best decks bubble to the top. And, at the beginning of a season, you see everything. You see everything under the sun. Well, now the Pro Tour's over, and people are kind of settled down, and they figured out where they want to be. Of course, there will be decks that pop up, such as the deck that we'll be talking about a little bit later. I'm surprised this deck actually still exists. I haven't seen it in quite some time. But, decks bubble to the top. It just, exactly like a bubble. They come to the top, they settle there, they burst, and then another deck bubbles to the top again. And this is just a rotation away Standard and even Legacy and Vintages. They always seem to be in that fashion where they just suddenly become, hey, look at this really powerful deck. It's like, all right, cool. And then everybody knows how to play around it.
Yeah, and this is definitely a great way to scout out the competition. You can see what other decks are doing well and get an idea of where those decks, of what cards they're playing and how they might be prepared for your deck. Another great resource for deck lists is mtgtop8.com. This is great because it'll show you a lot of major events and sometimes some smaller events from shops around the world and even some mid-go events. And it breaks down the top 8, sometimes even more than the top 8. They'll show you like the top 16 or so and give you a nice breakdown of what those decks look like.
Yeah, it's a very simple format of a site. It shows the deck. It allows you to click on it. You can see the archetypes, the percentages, the way they break down. It also shows off the card and what they look like, of course, once you click on it. And it shows you the prices on MTGO and on normal paper, kind of what TCG mid, I think, is, or low, whatever it may be. And it shows you main board, creatures, spells and instances, others, which would be enchantments, artifacts, things like that. And then finally the sideboard itself. So it's actually a really cool, simple formatted site where you just pull it up, you can look up something, and just like that, you're going to find it.
Yeah, exactly. It's very easy to find decks for specific formats. And they do sort them by, like if you're looking for a specific type of list, let's say you're playing Infect in Modern. So you go to their Modern page, you select Infect, and it'll show you, here's all the top performing Infect lists from the past couple of events, and you can look at all of them and see the different variations on the deck. A third source that you could use, this is from the website mtggoldfish.com. They have a section of the website, it's their metagame page, and they have one for all of the popular constructed formats, and this will show you a breakdown of what percentage of the meta is each deck is representing. So for instance, if we're looking at the standard metagame page, looking at the last few competitive events and the NTGO standard leagues, Team Aetherworks right now is about 30% of the meta. So this will give you a very easy look as to, if you're going into a blind meta, what you may expect. And if you click on one of those, it will give you one of the most recent lists that performed well, and then underneath it'll give you a breakdown saying, okay, this card was a 4 of in 100% of decks. This card was a 3 of in 75% of decks, and things like that.
And it really shows good percentages, which is very, very nice. I kind of like a more graphed out statistics, I think is the word I'm looking for. It's more statistical, so it lets you know what the meta looks like. Because, let's say I'm going to go to Star City Games this weekend. I'm going to play in one of their big events. I have no idea what the meta game is. I can look on MTG Goldfish, and they will show me what the percentage is going to be. And I can be like, okay, cool. Let me test against this deck. Let me test against that deck. All right, I'm more prepared. Well, I better watch out for this deck as well, because this is kind of bubbling to the surface.
Yeah, and that is one of the downsides of their metagame page is, yes, there are no graphs. It's all just the numbers. So if you're a visual learner, it may be a little bit more difficult for you to read that section of the page. But it is a good source for quickly finding a deck list for each archetype. And one of the last places you can look, of course, is some of the major content outlets like Star City Games and Channel Fireball. They're always putting out content, showing you new deck lists and showing you gameplay of the decks. And a lot of times it's not as analytical or as number crunchy as some of these other options that are out there, but you do get to see the deck in action very easily through their videos and through their articles.
Star City Games and Channel Fireball, they're always putting out content. Literally, I don't know a day where they haven't put out 3 or 4 articles, per day. And sure, some of them, like Star City requires you to be premium, and that, that does suck from time to time. But of course, you go to their event, they give a month subscription for free, and you can find it anywhere on the internet. So besides that, really, there's so much information. The world is oversaturated with the amount of Magic content out there. There's so much to absorb. And with Star City and for Channel Fireball to put their big name players, like a lot of Pro Tour players, Reed Duke, Eric Froelich, LSV, things like that, onto the Channel Fireball page and stuff along those lines, you learn way more than you actually think you would. And sometimes they put out goofy things. For example, they just put a thing out. Well, what happens if all these creatures enter the battlefield at the same time? It's a little brain teaser. It keeps you thinking. It's something different.
Yeah, a lot of their articles and videos outside of decks are always really good for keeping you on your toes. You get to learn a couple of weird rules interactions sometimes, but yeah, mostly if you're looking for a deck to play and you don't know how that deck operates, these videos are a great way to see it in action.
Yeah, they have a lot of content. I recommend checking them out. Subscribe to them on YouTube and stuff like that, and finding them on Facebook. You'll learn way more, and you'll become a better player because of it, honestly.
Now, once you've selected your deck, it's time to identify what the deck's game plan is. And if you haven't seen the deck in action, let's say you have some trouble finding a video of someone playing it, there's a couple of steps that you can take to figure this out. One of the first steps is looking at the number of lands that the deck plays. Depending on the format, the number of lands will suggest a couple of different things. Usually less lands is going to mean it's an aggro deck, or it's looking to end the game quickly, or it doesn't need to draw many lands to cast its spells. And if it has more lands, it's likely going to be a control deck. The numbers change for each format. Right now, in Standard, you're looking at anywhere from like 22 to 24 lands. Means you're an aggro style deck. You're looking to play creatures or threats within the first couple turns of the game. And then if you're going upwards from there, you're going up to 26 or 27 lands, you're looking at more of a control deck.
Yeah, exactly. The more lands kind of indicate more, the longer the game should go, honestly. 19, 20 lands, you're looking to end the game pretty quick. 24, 25 lands, you're looking for a long game. And you don't notice that at first. But once you start really looking into a lot of information, you'll notice like, oh, so that's why that combo deck really only plays like 5 basics.
Yeah, when you get into Vintage and Legacy, that's when the land count can be a little bit, it can fluctuate a little bit more because just the strategies being used by some of the decks, you can really cut down on the number of lands you're playing. But generally, the concept still stays the same. The less lands, the faster the deck is. The more lands, the slower the deck is.
Yeah, it's kind of the gist.
Mm-hmm. Now, once you've identified where this deck sits as far as its gameplay speed, now one of the places to look is the mana curve. So that is, of course, if you were to make a bar graph, with each bar being each converted mana cost of the cards being played in the deck, you should be able to see like a curve, most likely. Like it's going to go up and peak and come back down most of the time. And this mana curve is really going to help illustrate when this deck is putting pressure on its opponent, or when it's really going to turn on for the most part. For instance, I'm looking at an aggro deck right now in Standard, and I can see it peaks up at 2 converted mana cost, and it drops back down pretty quickly because it plays a lot of 2-drops to turn on the pressure immediately. Now, after you've identified where the mana curve sits, you definitely want to look at the we're going to call these the power cards, and these are the cards that the high power cards that are being played in the deck, and most likely what the deck is built around. If we were to look at a Standard list, for instance, we've got the Temur Aetherworks Marvel. You've got, of course, your Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger, and your Aetherworks Marvel. And those cards are both very powerful in their own right, and definitely the reason why anyone would be playing that deck.
With that being said, certain decks, Legacy and Modern and stuff like that, let's look at like a Storm-based deck. Well, I mean, you can go for the namesake cards, Grape Shot, Empty the Warrens, Tendril of Agony, but let's look a little deeper. You're looking at fast mana. You're looking at quick cantrips, Serum Vision, Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain, things like that. The fast mana being Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual, Pyretic Ritual, Desperate Ritual, things like that. All these ritual-style effects, because that's the namesake of the deck, to generate a bunch of mana and then combo off. So, quick, efficient cards, it's probably going to be very aggressive. If you see a Dark Ritual turn 1, you're probably scared.
Yeah, exactly. Dark Ritual turn 1 means the game is usually going to end really quickly.
Yeah, or they're just resolving a Necropotence, and you're just like, oh, crap.
And then you're like, wait a second, you can't do that in Legacy. Now, after you've identified the power cards of the deck, the decks that kind of are the big gears in the clockwork that is the list, you want to look at the synergies, and this is going to be what kind of helps fill in the gaps and helps link those cogs together in this clockwork that we have. So with Aetherworks Marvel, you've got Aetherworks Marvel itself has synergy with a lot of the deck. It allows you to cast spells that are much more expensive than you should be able to cast on that turn, and then you have all your energy generating cards which synergize with that. So you have your Attune with Ether, your Rogue Refiners, your Whirler Virtuosos. Those feed into the Aetherworks Marvel and allow it to be strong. And same with Storm. The rituals act as your synergy cards because those help build up your Storm count as well as give you the mana to cast your more expensive spells like your Dark Petition or the Tendrils of Agony itself or your Past in Flames, depending on what build you're playing.
A good example of this is, you can go off of Ulamog, but again, let's look a little deeper. What about the puzzle knots? The puzzle knots indicate that you're generating as much energy as you can as fast as you can. That's a big deal. You're looking at, you can look at turn 1 Attunement Aether, turn 2 Puzzle Knot. You know exactly what you're playing against now.
Yeah, exactly. The Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot is really one of the big key synergy cards in Etherworks Marvel because the card by itself gives you enough energy to pop Etherworks Marvel, and then if you accidentally miss on your Marvel spin, there's a good chance you hit a Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot and you can just go again the next turn. It also helps out with the deck as it sometimes doesn't play a lot of creatures for board presence early. It can only deal with threats 1-for-1, and so Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot helps it recover from really bad starts. So you find a lot of synergy with that card working within the deck in multiple different ways. And then if we go into even other decks, if you look at Modern Infect, for instance, Modern Infect, your synergy cards are the cards that help protect your creatures. So that would be Vines of Vastwood, or in some builds, even now Blossoming Defense. Those not only help pump your creatures to advance your game plan faster, but also can protect your creatures from kill spells or lightning bolts or anything like that. And so those cards are kind of 2-in-1. They synergize with the deck in 2 different ways.
There's a lot of synergy in the deck that is able to, be built around with, basically.
Mm-hmm. Now, after you've identified these synergy cards and you kind of have a good grasp on how the deck operates at this point, if you've identified these cards correctly, and really identifying the cards correctly is mostly just looking at the list as a whole and reading the cards. A lot of times, once you've read the cards, you can get a good idea of where each of them fits in as a synergy card or a power card or anything like that. The next place to look is what tools the deck is using to fight the current metagame. So, depending on what metagame the deck is going to, it may be running different sideboard options, or it may be running cards that would be in the sideboard in the main board now. So, for instance, in Legacy, you might see a deck running Knight of Soul's Betrayal in its sideboard. And that's a legendary enchantment that costs 2 black, and it says all creatures get -1/-1. And you'll see these show up when someone goes to a metagame where they expect True Name Nemesis to be there, because True Name Nemesis gets protection from a chosen player when it enters, most of the time the controller's opponent. And then it can't be killed, it can't be blocked, and Dinosaur's Betrayal kills it right on the spot.
Even though it's got protection against from the player that has a Knight's Soul Betrayal, the state-based action says all creatures get -1/-1, so he's a 3/1 and dies instantly, which is great, because that card is very annoying to play against, especially when it has a Uzawa's Jitte on it. You can't win.
Or you might see, in Legacy or even in Modern, someone packing 1 to 3 copies of Engineered Explosives in their sideboard, and you'll see those a lot against token decks. So Engineered Explosives is a really great answer to a Storm deck that's looking to kill with Empty the Warrens. It's a great answer to a Young Pyromancer deck. Or in Modern, it's a good answer to someone playing black-white tokens with Bitter Blossoms and Gideon Ally of Zendikar and things like that.
Yeah, and then the best part about Engineered Explosives is, let's say your opponent has a bunch of Swift Spears and Goblin guys on the field. 3 mana to destroy their board, probably going to win after that.
And then when we look into Standard, you'll probably see decks that are playing red have Magma Sprays, and that's of course going to help out a lot in the matchups against the Zombies decks. against vehicles to kill scrap heap scroungers, against any of the aggro decks because creatures have low toughness. So if you see magma sprays, that's because the pilot was expecting any number of those decks. It's kind of a general purpose card that's going to show up in every list that has red, but the number of them will change depending on what metagame they expect.
Exactly. If they're expecting a fast aggro metagame, you're going to see 4 all day long. If you're expecting a lot of Marvel, but you don't want to lose to Mardu, zombies, 2 or 3 is probably the right spot. If you're expecting a heavy control meta, you're probably going to run 1, maybe 2.
Yeah, 1, maybe 2 to deal with the odd guy out who's playing black-white zombies, things like that. Once you've got all of that together, you should have a very good idea of where your deck sits, as far as what speed the deck wants to play at, what turns are the important turns for the deck to be doing something, what are the strongest cards in the deck, how the cards work together, and how it usually deals with different metagames. Once you've got all this information, the next thing you have to identify is what decks are people playing in your area. And this you can do just by going to events. You don't have to be in the event. Let's say you want to get into Modern, but you don't know what to be ready for. Just show up to Modern events and watch.
Just watching the events show you a lot of information. For example, if you go to our local event or a local tower event, there's a lot of burn. Well, it's time to pack ley lines.
Yeah, there's a lot of burn and actually a fair amount of hand disruption in our local Modern metagame, so Ley Line of Sanctity is almost a must-have for a lot of decks. And if you are playing in the event, biggest thing you can do to improve your knowledge of your local metagame is scout out the other tables in between rounds. You know, let's say you finish your round in 15 to 20 minutes. Get up, walk around, look at what everyone else is playing, and look at how those decks operate so you understand what you need to be ready for.
So you'll go into a metagame, and let's say you're playing a Nausea. All right, your games are going to finish before the 30-minute mark. You're either going to win, you're going to lose. You win, congratulations. You lose, doesn't matter. Go scout. You want to know what you're going to be playing against. You want to know who's going to be playing the next deck. You also want to see if they know any tips or tricks on their own deck. For example, Storm in Modern runs Remand. Well, you can remand your own Grape Shot, which I had no idea, and you're able to recast it. For a while, I had no idea, and that is so cool to me. And that's a trick I didn't know about.
Yeah, I actually only knew about that trick because for a short time I was playing Reset High Tide in Legacy, and there were times where to kill your opponent you had to cast Brain Freeze and play your one of Remand to remand your Brain Freeze back and replay the Brain Freeze again. Because you would play one of Remand just for that trick or for against certain spells you would be able to gain value off of. It's definitely a very, very cool trick that Storm can do, and one that you probably wouldn't know unless you watch the deck in action or talk to the pilot. And that's kind of our next point. Another way to understand what people are playing in your meta is to talk to them. You know, be social. Go around to the players in your local metagame, talk with them, get to know them, and figure out, you know, hey, you're playing this, you know, how should I sideboard against that deck? Or, hey, I've seen you play against Burn a lot. What are your tips for playing against Burn?
And again, the only real way of learning how to play is to play the decks. Not only playing against them, but playing with them.
One really good thing, if you have a friend that plays in your local events, is sit down with him and trade decks and just test it out. Get a feel for how Infect's pilot wants to play the game, so that when you're playing against Infect, you can put yourself in their shoes and think, okay, he's attacking with the Glistener Elf into a board where I can obviously block and kill it. What does he have? And definitely the last thing to be ready for in your local metagame, especially if you're just going to small events at local shops, is be ready for rogue decks. You're always going to have... Every local metagame has players that are going to show up with the weirdest off-the-wall decks, you know, a tier 4 deck that no one's even thought of, and because no one was ready for it or knew how the deck operated, they're just going to get blown out by it.
Yeah, exactly, and that's when those players just absolutely crush an event.
Yeah, like recently, actually, in for Amonkhet Game Day, I took a four-color Energy Super Friends deck for Standard, and in the second event of Game Day, I sat across from someone playing a green-white Panharmonicon combo deck, and I made a mistake of not leaving up Harness Lightning because I didn't realize he would be able to go off that turn, and he proceeded to generate infinite mana and infinitely bounce his Thought-Knot Seer to force me to mill myself out because I was tapped out and couldn't interact at all. And it's little things like that. You have to be ready for weird off the wall strategies like that.
And it's hard. It's hard. It really is, and it feels bad when you lose to something like because you're like, wow, I could have just done this and been fine. But guess what? You'll never do it again. I promise you. You'll lose to a deck, you'll lose to a certain interaction, and it will never in your life ever happen again because you're going to remember that. You remember your bad matchups. You never remember your good matchups. It's very true.
Yeah, very, very much. And that's actually good because you improve as a player by remembering what not to do a lot of the time. Because you go, okay, no, don't go that way. Go this way. Play the right cards this turn. Now, once you've kind of identified what decks are being played in your area, the next thing to do is figure out what works well against those decks. And one of the biggest things that will come up a lot is, let's say in Standard, you're playing a green-white deck, and you're running into a lot of zombies and a lot of scrap heap scroungers. Now, some of the best options in white are Declaration in Stone and Stasis Snare. Cast Out is usually a bit too slow for those matchups, but Magma Spray, as we said earlier, is extremely good against these sorts of cards. So this is when you got to start asking yourself, okay, the best card to deal with this is in another color. Should I splash that color or change to that color? Adjust the deck to fit that.
Yeah, and again, adjusting a deck, it takes a lot of practice. And it takes a lot of information and gathering, and don't just study. You have to do the test.
Yeah, you have to make sure you're testing out the deck with each iteration and make sure before you show up to an event and go, okay, well, I'm splashing red for these 3 cards in my sideboard, figure out if it actually works. Another thing to look at when you're figuring out these tools to beat your local decks is, of course, the versatility. So certain cards are more versatile than others. For instance, in the same point I was just making there, Magma Spray is actually not that versatile a card. It can kill anything with 2 toughness, or it can combine with one of your creatures to kill anything with more toughness, but it can't deal with an Ulamog, can't deal with a Gideon. So that's when you start looking at cards like Stasis Snare and Declaration in Stone, which are a lot more versatile, even though they are not as efficient as Magma Spray.
Exactly, and you'll find that out with a lot of cards too. You'll soon find out, like, Negate, it's a good card, but it's not the best card in your deck. Disallow is the best card in your deck. You'll soon find out that Remand really isn't the best card in your deck. It's Cryptic Command. Force of Will really isn't the best card in your deck. It's actually like Swords of Plowshare.
Yeah, stuff like that. It's definitely the versatility of your answers is a really huge part in what makes or breaks a sideboard. Now, after you've gotten all of this information together, start going towards those specific answers if a certain deck is extremely popular. In Modern, if you know Storm is extremely popular, you may want to start packing some hate cards specifically for Storm in your sideboard. Stuff like Eidolon of Rhetoric, which keeps your opponent from casting more than 1 spell per turn. It forces them to deal with that before anything else. Usually not effective against any other decks, but if you know there's 50% of your local store's players are on Storm, Eidolon of Rhetoric is going to win you a lot of games in those events.
Eidolon of Rhetoric, man, that card makes me mad.
I know it does. It turns off a lot of combo decks. And that's the thing. It's a very specific answer to combo decks that want to cast multiple cards in one turn. So that would be in Modern, you've got Storm, you've got Ad Nauseam, you've got Eggs, you've got a handful of other combo lists that show up. And then in Legacy, you've got Storm and a few other lists as well. So if you know that you're facing up against these sorts of combo decks, not the 1-2 punch types, but the ones that want to go off with an engine, Idol Nevrotic might be a really great choice.
Exactly.
And as you said before, Danny, make sure to test your deck. Test it and test it and test it until you get tired of playing that deck. And then test it some more. Because you need to make sure that the adjustments that you're making to try and beat your local metagame actually work. Don't just show up to a metagame full of zombies and say, okay, well, I think these cards are going to work against zombies. Make sure that they do.
Exactly, because if you just walk into an event and you're just like, these will work, well, you better be 100% right instead of confident. Being confident is important. It really is. Walking into an event going, I can win this. That's different from going, these will work and I got this. That's a different world.
Yeah, and definitely the first place to start with testing is proxying your deck and playing it against your local players. So that could be as easy as just take a slip of paper, write down the card name on it, and slide it into a card sleeve. Or you could even, go all out and print out a proxy and slip that in a card sleeve, stuff like that. That way you can physically have the deck in your hands and understand, what the deck is trying to do each turn, and if the answers that you're packing for these specific decks are efficient enough, or if they're too slow, or if they're too narrow, or anything like that. Outside of proxying your deck, if you don't feel like going through all that work, or if maybe you can't leave the house so much, there's always Magic Online. A lot of decks are a lot cheaper on Magic Online compared to paper. Or, if you're looking for a free option, there's always X-Mage and Cockatrice, which allow you to easily link up with people online and test out your decks against each other.
Yeah, I play MTGO, I play X-Mage, and I also play in paper as well because I need to practice. I don't get a chance to go out and play a whole lot as much as I would like. It's real nice to just be able to go, oh, I have this deck I want to try out on X-Mage and just slam it against a wall for an hour or two.
Yeah, and for me, the nearest card shops are half an hour either way for me, either north or south. So there are days where I really can't afford to do an extra hour of commuting to go play some games for a while. So instead I'll load up Magic Online, or I will load up X-Mage and just play against people. And one of the greatest things about X-Mage that I've found is some players will be more than happy to, give you some comments on your deck. Now some of those comments may be a bit more negative than others. You are, of course, dealing with the internet. But some people are more than helpful. You'll ask... You can ask them, hey, you were on zombies. Is there anything better that I could have done on my turn 4 than what I did? And they'll go, oh yeah, well if you had this card in your hand, you could have totally used that. Things like that. It's very similar to playing in person. Just be conversational with your opponent in those games, because in X-Mage and Cockatrice, there's really nothing at stake.
Exactly. I mean, and it doesn't matter either way. You really want to just get as much games in as possible. And being nice on the internet helps. It really does.
Yeah. Now, as you're testing the deck, you may run into cards that aren't performing as well as you imagined, when you were drawing up the deck. Or some cards are overperforming and you're like, okay, well this is doing this one of card in my deck is great literally every time I draw it. I want more copies. So you need to change your list. One of the biggest things when you change your list is track the different iterations of your list. Keep track of the different versions. That way, when you're on version 5 of your deck, and you go, okay, well, the deck was much better when I was playing 4 Selfless Spirits. What did that list look like again? You can just go right back to it. And one of the greatest tools for that is the website I've been using to put out the deck lists for our Brew of the Week every week, and that is deckstats.net. It's actually very cool because not only does it give you a full breakdown of your deck as far as mana curve, the color distribution of your deck, and the distribution of your mana sources, there's also a tab called Revisions, and you can actually go to that and compare specific revisions of your deck. So I can go back and say, okay, this is the version from back in March. I'm going to compare that to today's version and see what the differences are and see if I can find a middle ground between those, or maybe the March version is just the better one, stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's actually really nice. You've been using this for a while now when talking about the lists, and I find it a very, very cool application comparative to a lot of other like deck building things.
Yeah, it's definitely grown into my favorite one so far. I know we were using Tapped Out for a while, but Deck Stats has just been all upside for me. They update really quickly with the new set with Amonkhet. They got the cards in there really quickly, and entering cards into the deck is actually very straightforward and very easy. And then it just does all that math for you. You can even look up the probability that you will draw a card on any subsequent turn. So I could type in, okay, well, I want to have drawn 4 islands by turn 6. And it'll tell me the probability of that happening.
That's pretty sweet information, honestly.
Yeah, like all that math is really good. And I mean, honestly, that's how the pros do it, is they crunch the numbers and they go, okay, what are the chances of me having this curve of turn 2, turn 3, turn 4 every game? And they'll be like, okay, well, that's a 60% chance of that happening, so that's really good. Stuff like that. So not only is it good for comparing different revisions of your deck, it's also good for just looking at, getting really, really, really deep into the numbers of your deck.
Here's the thing. When you're trying to do number crunching, it really takes a specific mindset. You really have to be kind of in the proper mood, in the brain for it, and just being ready for it. Because the thing is you can play Magic all day long, but if you're not ready to learn at a deeper level, then you're not going to.
Getting better at the game does require work, like anything else, and putting in the time. And looking at the numbers and understanding the numbers is a big part of figuring out how strong your deck is, and understanding what those numbers mean, of course, is extremely big.
It is. It's very important.
Now, before we leave you this week, we're not going to have a Brew of the Week, but instead we're going to take a deck from Standard and go through all these steps that we just outlined and tweak this Netdeck. So, as Danny said at the beginning of the episode, this is a deck that existed a while ago in Standard. It died off, and now it's slowly coming back. And this is Blue-White Midrange. It used to be known as Blue-White Flash, because a lot of its threats have Flash, like Spellqueller and Archangel Avacyn, but it's becoming more of a mid-range deck with the loss of Smuggler's Copter and Reflector Mage.
Very happy those cards are gone.
Yeah, those cards kind of made this deck a bit too strong while it was around, in my opinion. But right now, it's kind of sitting in a good spot. It's made a couple of 5-0s in Standard Leagues. We've seen the list doing fairly well in a couple of larger events. So we're going to take a look at a couple of different versions of the list and talk about what a small local shop metagame might look like and what tweaks you would want to make to the deck. So first off, one of the things you can see if you look at the deck is most lists will be playing a full 4 of Thraben Inspector, of Spellqueller, of Archangel Avacyn, Gideon Ally of Zendikar, and Glorybound Initiate. You'll see these in 4-ofs in pretty much every single list.
These are the meat and potatoes of the deck. These cards are basically the reason why you're playing the deck and why it exists. Removing any of these cards at any point can really take a huge detriment to your deck. Even just swapping out one card, like let's say you want to take out a Glorybound Initiate. Well, now you got to put a 2-drop in its place, and there's not as many good 2-drops as you think there is in Standard right now.
Yeah, it's a little tough to come across a 2-drop as efficient as Glorybound Initiate is.
Card's busted.
Card's really strong. Now, past that, if we want to look at the number of lands, actually, as we discussed earlier, the number of lands helps a lot with determining the speed of the deck. Across the different versions of Blue-Eyed Midrange, we're mostly seeing 24 to 25 lands. So this puts us in the realm of a slower aggro deck or a mid-range deck. And of course, that's why we're calling it Blue-White Mid-Range. It's looking to maybe drop a couple of must-answer threats early, and then just dealing with your opponent's answers as they come. So that's why you're playing your Spell Quellers and your Archangel Avacyn's, because those will help turn off your opponent's answers very easily.
The cards are just very, very efficient in that fashion.
Mm-hmm. And then if we look at the curve of the deck, it does play a lot of 2-drops and 3-drops, and then it peters off very quickly to play to its 4-drops and 5-drops. Usually those slots are really just the 4 Avacyn's and the 4 Gideons, and maybe a handful of sideboard cards.
Yeah, and a lot of these sideboard cards, there are a lot of 1-ups in this list that we have right now. I'm not the biggest fan of how many there are, but this is where you're able to take your energy and place it towards. And be like, okay, well, the main board is like nearly impossible to change around besides maybe the metal rebukes. You could change those out probably. Everything else, the sideboard, like it's got some room for improvement. That's for sure.
Yeah, the sideboards across Blue-White Midrange lists, they change a lot because there's a lot of different answers you can be playing in Blue-White. And that's when we get into the tools against the current metagame. We're seeing a lot of lists playing Declaration Stone, but we're seeing a lot of variation on the numbers across the 75. We're seeing some versions playing 2 of, some playing 3 of, some playing a full 4 of, to be able to deal with specific answers. And of course, the more copies of Declaration Stone that you're playing, the better your zombies matchup is, because you're going to be able to deal with their wide board of zombie tokens. You're going to be able to deal with their gigantic Diagraph Colossus permanently, or deal with their Dread Wanderers or Scrap Heap Scroungers permanently.
Or the Ulamogs.
Or Ulamogs out of Etherworks Marvel. Yes, because Declaration Stone is a very efficient answer against Ulamog. Just because, if they hit the turn 4 Ulamog and exile 2 of your lands, you can still cast Declaration Stone most of the time. Now, past that, there are a few versions of the deck playing Metallic Rebuke. And this is an especially strong card against Etherworks Marvel right now, because with this deck, you're playing your Thraben Inspectors, which give you clues, and then in some versions you're playing Ethersphere Harvester or some other vehicle. And Metallic Rebuke gives you a very quick, efficient answer to an Etherworks Marvel. It's going to be very hard for them to get the extra 3 mana to pay for it that early in the game, and in the meantime, you can just beat them in the face.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's really cool, the Metallic Rebuke seeing play in a few of these lists. Now, we do have other differences within the list. We're seeing some lists playing more and some lists playing less Selfless Spirits. Selfless Spirit is going to be really good in this deck against board wipes. So against anyone playing Chandra Flamecaller or Radiant Flames, or anyone with sideboard Fumigates, Selfless Spirit is going to help out a lot, and it's going to help out very much against decks that are going to attack in a lot, because you can leave all your guys back, and then when they go to attack, you block it. We block with everything and sacrifice your Selfless Spirit. And it's also very good as a way to turn on a board wipe, because you have your Archangel Avacyn, which when a non-angel creature you control dies, she flips and deals 3 damage to all creatures and each opponent. So you kind of have a built-in board wipe there as well. And that makes more Selfless Spirits very strong against aggro metagames. It's going to help you to block very efficiently, and then also give you a nice board wipe, while also being good in mid-range matchups, because you can basically counter a Fumigate with a 2-drop.
Mm-hmm. Selfless Spirit seems to be like just a standout card recently. It's been really powerful.
Now, one of the most interesting cards, and this may not be apparent at first glance why it's in the list, a few versions are playing Eldrazi Sky Spawner. So this guy saw quite a bit of play when Battle for Zendikar dropped, and we saw a lot of Eldrazi decks, like Eldrazi mirrors in Standard for a while. So he's 2 and a blue for a 2/1 with flying. He is devoid, so he has no color. And when he enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion that you can sacrifice to add 1 mana to your mana pool. So Sky Spawner is in the deck because he's a very efficient flying threat. And he's specifically in the deck to deal with zombies, actually. Because the 2/1 flying is actually really hard for zombies to deal with. They don't have reach, they don't have flying creatures of their own unless they're playing Bone Pickers. And even if they are playing Bone Pickers, Sky Spawner trades with it exactly. Then the 1/1 token that it leaves behind can very efficiently block a Crypt Breaker or a Dread Wanderer and just trade with it. And you basically didn't spend a card for that. So it makes this card really strong in the zombies matchup, as well as being efficient against Otherworks Marvel, because that Scion basically turns your Sky Spawner into a 2-drop instead of a 3-drop to be able to cast Metallic Rebuke if they, go to drop a Marvel. So he's kind of got like this 2-for-1 value in the deck.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a catch-all kind of card.
Yeah, very, very unassuming card, but he is definitely a role player. And I would say, especially if you're taking a blue-white mid-range deck into a metagame with a lot of zombies decks, definitely pack in these Eldrazi Sky Spawners. They're going to trade off with zombies threats very efficiently. And then if you're in a metagame with a lot of vehicles, I would recommend taking these guys out. They're not very useful against vehicles at all. He can block Heart of Kirin for a turn, but that's it. And vehicles, they're playing a lot of magma sprays recently to deal with zombies, so Sky Spawner doesn't really pair up that well against magma sprays. Now, for different sideboard options that you have available to you, there are a few lists that are running 24 lands that in the sideboard have a way to go up to 25 lands, go a bit slower, and you end up playing, for instance, Jason Raveler's Secrets, because his -2 ability is to return a creature to its owner's hand, is actually pretty efficient against black-green energy, because black-green energy, because they're playing Rishkars and a few lists playing Verdur's Gearhulks, they're going to have a tendency to pile counters onto something. So Jace is pretty efficient at bouncing that threat that they've piled a lot of counters on, and then you can deal with the rest of them with your Declaration in Stone, or with Stasis Snare, or when they go to replay the threat, you can counter it with Metallic Rebuke or Spell Queller, anything like that. Or, just keep it from attacking the next turn. Like if they drop a Verdur's Gearhulk and slap all the counters out to get a trample threat, you just bounce it to their hand and force them to do it again.
Most of the time, that just is good enough to seal the deal.
Mm-hmm. And then Sky Sovereign is going to be very good there as well, because that can deal with their smaller threats. Late game, they play a Constrictor. Sky Sovereign is going to blow that up. And then you can crew Sky Sovereign with a lot of the creatures in the deck. With Sky Spawner actually can crew Sky Sovereign very easily, because itself and the token together give you 3 power. Your Glorybound Initiates can give you 3 power. And then you get another 3 damage to hit something else with. Very, very efficient answer there. Also very good against vehicles, because the 3 damage can kill a lot of their ground creatures, and then when it attacks, it can deal 3 damage to a Gideon and just kind of start knocking that down just little by little. So you've definitely got a lot of different options for your sideboard, depending on what decks you're going to be going up against. You could run more counter spells if you expect a lot of Otherworks Marvel, more removal if you expect a lot of zombies or vehicles, more narrow remover if you expect a lot of vehicles. You can be running Fragmentize if you expect to have to deal with a lot of artifacts. So definitely a deck you can take in a lot of different directions, not just from the main deck, but from the sideboard as well.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways you can move this deck around, and that's really, really sweet. That's why I kind of like this as our best example of what's going on today.
Yeah, it's a very, very versatile deck for very, very good for a metagame that you can identify and you can bring the correct answers. A lot like how you might build a control deck and make sure you have the correct answers for what you're going to go up against. This gives you more of a mid-range feel while having those same deck building decisions.
Exactly.
And that about does it for this week. When you go out there and go to your local shop to play some standard, play some modern, or even heck, play some vintage, hopefully these tips will give you a lot of insight into how to take a well-performing deck and make the changes that it needs to compete well against your local metagame.
Yeah, with this knowledge, this definitely should help out a lot of players kind of figure out what they want to do when it comes to deciphering a metagame. And again, like we've been kind of saying over and over again, and it's a bit of a broken record on this one because it's really the biggest thing that can help you. Get out there and play. Practice, practice, practice is really what's going to help you more than anything else. We could tell you two are blue in the face on how to, take care of how to play a deck, what's going on, all the information. But unless you go out there and pick that deck up or play against that deck enough times, you're never really going to learn it. And I figured that out the hard way by playing Standard recently. Yep, that is right. I am playing Standard. And that's a big deal because I think Standard's okay right now. It's good enough for me to want to play. But I went in with just the basic information. I have really no idea how decks work, how things are tricky, how well Spell Queller is, how cards are working like this. I got kind of crushed over the past couple of weeks because I just have no idea what I'm doing. And that's because I've only done research and I never play.
Yeah, research can only get you so far. Being book smart doesn't get you everywhere. You got to get street smart. You got to go out there onto the streets and, deal with it yourself.
Exactly.
Make sure to keep up with us, to subscribe to our SoundCloud, subscribe to us on iTunes, and make sure to like, subscribe, and share out the YouTube version. I know that YouTube is much easier for a lot of people to access, so we're making sure to make that available every single week for you guys.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
So in between episodes, to keep in touch with us, you can find us on Twitter at WizBrewCast. You can email us at wizardsbrewcast@gmail.com. Danny and I will have our Twitters in the description, and we will see you guys next week.
All right, y'all. Have fun.